This is Building a DevOps Culture. My name is Randell. Slides and links, so I'm going to reference a couple of different things on the internet. So rather than have you feverishly scribble them down, I've got a GitHub repo up here that I will upload my slides up to after this talk in a PDF, as well as I'll put any links that I mentioned. There's a couple in particular. And I'll put this up again at the end, as well as I'll give the slides to Chris. They'll be up on the Software Architect site, as well as available through the app. So you'll be able to get those multiple ways. So who am I? I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. We're a small consultancy out of the United States who do a lot of work in the Microsoft space. I'm an ALM MVP for Microsoft, which means I spend way too much time with their tooling around Visual Studio, Team Foundation Server, and Visual Studio Online. I've co-authored a book that if you go and buy that at amazon.co.uk, I might get 25 pence or something. But in either case, I spend a lot of time with this, and DevOps in particular has become something that has now been formalized and codified in the industry. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is how you can bring this culture to your organization and some of the challenges you're going to face, and talk about how you can get around that possibly. When I think about who you might be, you attach the blinky thing to it. When I think about who you are, do you ever feel like this? Or how about that? Have you ever been on the phone with someone like that? Let's be honest. This is how we feel about technology sometimes, right? I mean, fundamentally, if you're in software development, you have one of the best jobs around, and you can also have one of the worst jobs around. I know for me, probably the worst part of this is dealing with my home technical support, my wife and my family, right? Because I work with computers, I obviously have all the answers, and if something's not working, I have all the trouble. And it was funny that this morning of all times, I got up and logged on. I was doing an email in the hotel room, and I needed to get something off of my computer at home. So I went to log in and couldn't get to it. Now, luckily, I have two connections, so I went to the older, slower DSL connection. I was able to get in and basically figured out that my faster cable connection was down. So I put a note out there, checked, and sure enough, they're having trouble. Great. And this is about 2 a.m. Pacific, so my wife's going to get up about 6:30, and my children are going to get up. And like any connected family, they're all going to try and get onto the internet. So I had to send an email and say, sorry, it's not my fault. They're working on it. And so when you think about how something as simple as that affects larger enterprises, we start thinking about how do we prevent problems. Now, fundamentally, probably the biggest thing to realize is that this idea of a software company isn't really in existence anymore, because every company is a software company. If you fundamentally think about a modern organization, you can't really get by without some type of software. And then what's happening in more mature organizations, particularly small, medium, and large that are showing maturity, are realizing that that competitive advantage can be had through software. Now, granted, we do have entire industries that seem to start up out of software. A good example is Uber. Right? Here's a company that doesn't have any traditional infrastructure, doesn't even own their own cars. Right? What they've done is create a business out of software. But that doesn't mean that existing enterprises go away just because of that. And that means if you want to have an advantage in your industry, it's often going to come from custom software that helps your business be more agile and respond to demands out there. So when we think about modern software development, you're really thinking about how agile can you be and how quickly can you respond. When we think about this cycle, we have to plan what we're going to do, develop and test it, get out to production, and then hopefully monitor and learn what goes on. Right? In particular, what we're trying to do is change the cycle from a very reactive, something's on fire mentality, there's bugs, it doesn't work, it's broken, and move to we've released something, it works, it doesn't work, we can quickly fix it and adapt. We find out from both a standpoint of functionally does it work, right? Does it have a problem? To the more subtle, does it work for our users, right? Oftentimes, a software developer's interaction with a user, a customer, a person, is that screaming person on the phone, or it's that hate-filled email, or God forbid you have a public website where they can leave comments, right? The thought process behind half the internet, it seems, is just to troll you with the most abusive language possible. So what we're trying to do is reduce those cycles, and therefore reduce the friction point that occurs between the use of our software and the people who use it. DevOps itself is really an emerging trend. And for some people, they've been doing it all along. They just didn't have it codified. But a lot of organizations, it isn't. In particular, because lots of organizations, particularly enterprises, have separate silos responsible for development versus operations. And so the idea behind DevOps is changing from the top down the culture of a company and how it manages its software systems. And so this quote from CIO Magazine is basically just saying, look, if you want a sustainable advantage, you're going to have to be agile. And you have to be agile beyond the actual creation of the code, but all the way through to the enterprise, and think about how fast you can respond, right? Respond to those business changes, right? One of the things we think about with agile software is this notion of a first mover advantage. When you think about the companies that first did something competitive, in the United States, Alaska Airlines was one of the first airlines to allow you to do online check-in and print your boarding pass at home. FedEx, of course, made a name for it worldwide for fast package delivery, right? Amazon, another company that changed the way we thought about buying products online to the point of adding things like, hey, give us some subscription money in advance, and we'll give you free deliveries all year long. And we'll make it 2-day, at least in the US. And I know here in the UK, you guys can even get single-day delivery as part of your Prime membership. So those companies all were able to do that, not from sheer will and manpower, but by adding technology. I mean, how many of you would think about flying an airline now if you couldn't do some type of online check-in? And arguably, some won't even let you. Like Ryanair charges you extra if you want to check in at the airport, right? They still charge you for a seat now, or is it just for baggage, right? I mean, they were trying to do that one where you stand up or kind of lean, I thought it was. So when you think about it, right, technology really is at the core of everything we do in business. So when we think about DevOps, right, and take this notion of bringing together two things that seem completely separate, the first thing is we're thinking about this full lifecycle investment. And this has been this evolution in the industry as we've grown more mature, right? Does anybody here work on a software team that doesn't use source control? You do? I'm sorry, you need to leave now.
Sorry, we're having trouble getting one in. It's an old 4GL code base we've got.
Okay. Well, you're working on it. Okay, well, at least you're working on it. That's good. The first thing you don't want to hear from the audience is what source control, right? Then we know we're in the wrong room. No, the meeting for the Dentists Association is around the corner. What's happened is we've started baselining some things that most organizations should have and take for granted, which is things like version control, the ability to track work. We modeled those things in the 90s around what was called the software development lifecycle, the SDLC. And then as the industry's matured, we started thinking about, well, there's much more to software. And as software has permeated industry and most modern organizations, what we're saying is we need to think about a larger picture. And that's where ALM comes in, application lifecycle management. Now, ALM has three core tenets. It has development, it has operations, and then it has governance. When we think about governance, that's all the stuff that most of the time developers don't want to think about if you're a software person. And that it's, how's this thing going to get paid for? How are we going to allocate resources? But it's also, how does a software project fit into a larger organizational need? I'm sure you're familiar with Boeing and Airbus, right? Boeing recently launched their 787 Dreamliner. We'll avoid the battery discussion. But that plane cannot function without software. An Airbus A380 cannot function without software. But as we know, right, the amount of money it costs to build a single aircraft is in the millions of pounds. As such, when you're managing the budget for that, software is a component of that. But if you're thinking of a larger scale budget, you're not thinking necessarily about if the developer is using C# or Java or some other language, right? You're kind of looking at a much higher level view. And so governance in ALM is that we have this separation between how the developers might work, but the fact that they might need to provide data up to the larger organization. Okay, so ALM is all about thinking about software from inception, that idea, to when it's actually taken out of life. Now, the thing about ALM is that it is modeled on the more traditional separation of concerns between development and operations. It sees those as two different entities. And what's changing now is that we're saying that doesn't work. That actually creates too much friction between the two different portions of their organization, in that when development hands it off, it's kind of like this, okay, I finished, I did my part, here it is, throw it over the wall. You get it in production, you monitor it, you take care of it. And if something bad happens, let me know. And what we want to do is change that so that the full cycle is focused around end to end and having people involved. Now what this does mean, there's going to be a psychology change that has to take place in organizations. You're still going to have specialists at the fringes that don't interact at the core layer. What you're also going to find is a lot of people that traditionally were siloed, like test people, like people in operations who monitor, are going to have to know more about the other person's job. They're actually going to have to interact at a core level if you want to be successful. And that's why we really like to say that DevOps is a team undertaking. In particular, and I'll repeat this multiple times, DevOps is not something you buy. If a vendor tries to sell you a DevOps solution, you need to be skeptical. Because no software is going to make you successful if your people aren't in line, particularly if management's not in line. Right? One of the biggest problems I find when I consult organizations is not the line people. It's not even the mid-level management. It's when we start getting up to directors and C-levels who want to maintain their fiefdoms and their controls, particularly in organizations that have directors of development and directors of IT or directors of operations. I'm working with two different customers. They're both very large companies doing billions of dollars of business. One's a bit larger and has a larger organizational structure. But the group I'm working with goes up to a certain point where I got tons of buy-in, right? They're trying to do all the right things. But recently they had to get rid of their IT operations person, the person in charge, because she wasn't on board with the new plan. She wanted to control and protect her things. She was against bringing in certain technologies, and she really was a blocker to development. It took someone on the board level, right? The president had to fire her. Right? That was the solution to the culture problem. So it's got to be something that's ingrained in the organization that you're going to mature, otherwise you're going to fail. And so what we're trying to do with DevOps is to enable better software delivery, better practices from getting the code from a developer's hands into the customer's hands, the user, the person that needs to actually try and do something with it. And so ultimately, what we want to do is accelerate that last mile of continuous delivery. Now, think about all the things that are driving it, right? It starts from the fact that we've matured as an industry. Developers have gone on board with the word and the practice of agile. Now, whether it's little a agile or big A agile, I really don't care, right? I'm not a robe and sandals type of person. Mostly from my age, I know that you can't be too dogmatic about things. You got to be more pragmatic. Take the best you can and find what works in your organization. Now, that said, certain things like Scrum, for example, are really good methodologies, but they only work if you follow them. Right? I'd go into too many organizations that say, oh yeah, we're doing Scrum, but we do things a little differently on that. You can't do Scrum but and be successful, right? Ken Schwaber just goes nuts whenever he hears that term, right? So whether it's big A or little a, the concept is simple, right? Valuing people over these processes, the way we do things, thinking about how we interact, valuing the customer and valuing that interaction. And so development teams have gotten better. One of the problems with Scrum, at least as it is today, is that Scrum kind of draws the line at what happens when the software is done. That's actually a thing where Scrum needs to decide if it's going to mature or if it's going to focus on that, and there's going to be something else that picks up the pieces. Scrum is very cyclical in that we're going to improve our process of the development team. But once I ship something, it's not my problem as a Scrum team member to worry about how it gets into production. In fact, the argument is that we deliver units of value as a Scrum team. It's up to the customer to decide when they want to take it. Now, that does work to some degree, and it actually fits into a lot of organizations when you think about that separation of concerns. But it does create a friction point, which is, well, if it doesn't get into production, how do I know I really did the right thing? Right? If it sits there on the shelf for 3 weeks because it's blocked by IT deployment, how do I know what I did is right? Right? That's one of the problems. But in general, we've seen an increase in maturity. We've seen teams building higher quality software, and they're doing it faster. Which means we start thinking about how does it get into production, right? We start thinking about release pipelines. We start thinking about how do we get software out there so that it can be evaluated, tested, reviewed, and ultimately taken into production. And then once we do get to that cycle of production, how do we know when something bad happens? Do we know before our user does, or is it the screaming phone call we get? Or is the headlines news that our company's website's been down for half the day and customers are stranded? Just last week, Delta Airlines had a problem. And I'm only going by what I heard and what I read, so I don't know the actual facts, so I'm actually being a gossiper. But they were definitely down, and they had to issue paper tickets for people. Caused a few problems for people, right? Delta is, I don't know if they're number one, who's number one anymore in the US. They keep trying to go back and forth, but we've gone from 6 large airlines to 3. So a huge number of people are impacted because of their IT failure, right? So what we want to do if we're in development and if we're in a part of a software team and a DevOps team, we want to know as soon as possible that something's not working right and hopefully head it off of the path. And that means that as we learn from this and we start cycling back, that feeds our backlog, right? A backlog is a list of new requirements, new features, new things that users want. Heck, you can think of it as a child's Christmas wish list, right? Anything you want to do to your software solutions are captured on a backlog. And then the goal is that it gets triaged and prioritized. So this is a constant cycle. The biggest thing that's happening is we've gotten away from, if you think about the mythical man month, these large-scale multi-year projects. You're crazy if you're on a software team doing anything like that, right? If you're a developer, you should be only looking 1 or 2 sprints out. A sprint being 2 to 4, maybe 6 weeks, right? But a short cycle time, right? If you're in management, yes, you should be looking out a few months out. And yes, if you're doing budgeting, you probably have to do annual budgets. But when you start looking at those scales, right, the actual stuff that affects the backlog is in that shorter cycle. Yeah, there's visions. We want to have a mobile solution if we don't have one, right? Those get into larger scale epics and feature planning. But at the end of the day, we're just talking about what developers are doing and how that's affecting production. It's short cycle times that are going to make you win. Now, the fun thing is, there's lots of DevOps flavors out there today, just like we have different flavors of Agile, right? Where we're getting a lot of our production learning from is from what often people will call WebOps, from some of the big internet providers. So Google, Amazon, Twitter, Flickr, Xbox Live, Facebook. Those are all examples of organizations that have adopted a rapid release cycle. A cycle that typically is focused around a hub set of technologies, either website or services, and then those websites and services are accessible through different touch points, right? So if you have Facebook, I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, Europe tends to be ahead of the game, I think, when it comes to mobile adoption. I just remember being over here in the late 90s, early 2000s, people with all their Nokias and just texting like crazy. Just, texting in the US caught on way after it did here in Europe. And so I think about it, you walk around, you watch people, you have to watch where you're walking down the street and the subways because everybody's on their mobile, right? Until you get down to the barren caves in the tube. I remember last night, it's like, where's my cell service? It's gone, I'm lost. Kidding. But in either case, these companies, in order to survive and to be who they are, have to have a rigorous process where they can respond. In the middle, you see the no-ops, right? Which is, we kind of just do things, right? We have software, it kind of makes its way into production, and that's just what happens. The flip side is in this no-ops culture is startups tend to quickly fall into a DevOps culture because the small startup with a couple people involved often means that they're wearing multiple hats, right? The developer does the work and then pushes it out. Now, the instinct of a good developer is going to be, the A word, not agile, but automate, right? I don't want to have to do this over and over again. And so that very culture of saying, I want to automate, then leads us to this idea that, hey, we can reduce friction and get things out faster. And then you have enterprise DevOps, which is probably one of the more complicated ones to deal with because you're often fighting existing behavioral patterns where you have separations of concern, separation of responsibility, and separations of authority. And thus, getting things from one group to another often requires pulling teeth. And so what you have to figure out is, in all honesty, what type of culture do you have? WebOps culture is going to be very mature, right? That means you can deploy multiple times a day. It means you can push changes out. Typically, though, I find most of my customers are in the no-ops enterprise DevOps. I do work for Microsoft. In fact, I've worked with the Xbox Live team from just a tangential thing. I know people on the team. I tend to work with DevDiv. but in talking to one of the dev managers before, he told me a lot about how they do things. It was very fascinating and what they have to do to keep Xbox Live online, right? To keep those services available so gamers can play whenever they want. It's a very different world. So you have to think about which box do you fit into, and thus how are you going to approach this in your organization. So we start thinking about our goals and success metrics. It's really straightforward. Number one, you want to increase deployment frequency. So who here deploys every day or can deploy every day? Anybody? Fantastic. What do you do? What type of software?
Commerce.
Commerce? E-commerce? Are you
For me, it's like OTT.
hosted websites?
No, it's like VOD services.
Okay. Anybody else? No? All right. Who's lucky if they get software that they've built from them to their users within a month? Okay. Yeah. Right. That's typically what you run into, right? And depending upon the type of software you have and the age of it, right? One of my customers, they went from a software package they had built in the mid-2000s, around 2005, that was click once based with a set of back-end ASMX web services and traditional SQL Server database. And they've now tried to fast forward and get to a web-based user interface as well as dynamic mobile clients with modern web services, and they're still going to use SQL Server. But that whole change means they're having to change top to bottom because their previous dev manager and the way this CIO worked, they didn't see the value in being it until it got to the point where they were actually having trouble responding to their customers' needs. And so it often is to the point that some cultures won't change until they're faced with actually ruin of the company itself. So we want to increase deployment frequency so we can get those changes out there and respond to them. And then reduce that change lead time, right? Nothing worse for a user, why they hate us at times as our developers, is that they ask for a feature change and say, well, it's going to take 6 weeks. It's going to take a month. And particularly frustrated users is when it's often something, what they perceive as simple, right? I need an extra piece of data collected, right? It's our job to be the wizards to be able to make this happen. And so we've got this agility on the development side, and then on the ops side, we're thinking about reliability. Reduce the change fail rate, which is don't be afraid to deploy, right? That's often a big thing for a lot of organizations. You don't deploy often because you're afraid it's going to break. Also, oftentimes, the deployment process is a set of literature, right, that if you don't follow it exactly, what happens? It screws up, right? And often you're focused on, it might screw up, so you got to be prepared to fall back to the point that you do your updates over the weekend. You do it so that you have as much time as possible to make sure people don't know that it's hosed, okay? And what we're trying to do is get enough data about how our systems run in production so we know what that mean time to detect and repair is, so that we can figure out that if something bad happens, we can move forward successfully and solve the problem. Right? So these are things that we need to think about. So my first exposure to a formal definition of DevOps and people doing it was in 2009 from a couple guys at Flickr. Everybody's familiar with Flickr, right? The photo sharing site that now is part of Yahoo. So 2 guys from Flickr came and did a talk at O'Reilly's Velocity Conference in the US. And the talk was entitled DevOps something, but the core tagline I pick up on is 10 plus deploys a day. In 2009, that was really unheard of. Now, Flickr has some advantages that you might not have in your organization. I'll talk about some impediments you'll run into later. But Flickr had the advantage that they were a centralized environment, a website, right? When you're thinking about the web ops companies, they do have an advantage of that. Most of the stuff is controlled in one central place. Having lots of thousands of clients that you have to update can be an impediment to a successful DevOps regimen of multiple deployments a day. But fundamentally, what made it work for them is they changed their culture. If you watch the talk, and I'll give you a link for it, it'll be in my download links. I highly recommend you watching it. I will warn you, one of the guys has a foul mouth. It's not too horrible, but he does swear, so don't watch it with your children. But the core themes I took out of the talk is, first thing is automated infrastructure. Get the human out of the way. Humans are the biggest impediments to successful DevOps regiment of continuous delivery, because humans make mistakes. What you want to do is automate everything. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine at Microsoft on his Channel 9 show, Robert Greene. And he said, well, Brian, you know, one of the things that happens with DevOps to be successful is you really need organizational change. And you really do in the long run. But he goes, what can developers do? What could I do as a developer by myself to do better? And I'll give you the simplest thing. As a developer, the minute you add something to an application that requires a configuration change, requires something to be available, think about how you automate that. Start with, if you have to, a batch file, a PowerShell script. Avoid sitting down with your favorite language and building some kind of GUI, because that's just a rat hole for developers, right? Oh, I got to make it look nice, kind of stuff. Scripts are really good, and you really should, if you're in the Windows world, be doing some kind of scripting like JavaScript. If you're in the Linux or the OS X world, start looking at for deployment things like Chef and Puppet and those type of things, but even a bash script, right? The point is something that has to be configured in an environment to work. If you do it manually, if you do it more than once, replace that with some kind of automation. That's what you can do. Document it and automate it. And sometimes just the process of writing it down, not just doing, but writing it down, is half the battle. Because then someone else can even take that and add it to a larger scale automation infrastructure. Shared version control. Now, I gave the gentleman earlier a hard time, but yes, you really need to have version control as developers. But what about the IT folks? Right? Surprisingly, lots of people that I would consider in the IT part of the house don't do any version control. They might have automation scripts, but they just sit in a directory up on some network share. We need our brethren to be using version control. And honestly, I don't care. I'm not religious about it. Find what works for your organization and just use it. Okay? That said, version control has become one of those things like a text editor. You can get tons of good ones for free. Obviously, there's centralized version control products like Subversion, Team Foundation Server, and then there's distributed version control products like Git. Pick one, use one, embrace it. And the key is that word shared, though. And I'm not taking shared like in shared source. I'm talking about shared between development and IT. Now, it doesn't mean you give the IT pros the ability to do check-ins in your main code line that's for your production code. What I am saying is that you develop a location where you can share assets and resources related to how we get things into production and different environments. And by the way, when I use the term production, I mean anywhere other than a developer's workstation. Right? So that means a UAT environment, a test environment, a place where you stand up your application so it can be used and evaluated. All right? One step, build and deploy. Right? This means that a human does not get in there. And this is, I got to make a distinction between automated infrastructure and one-step build and deploy, and that automated infrastructure also means making sure the environments are available and can be available without human intervention. This means I need a new web server on my front end to handle load, right? I need additional disk space, right? These should be things that can be invoked and managed in an automated fashion. Particularly in the world of virtualization, which it's hard to find companies that aren't doing some virtualization, you should be able to stand up a new machine very quickly, to the point that maybe you support full self-service, right? Whereas a developer, I can go set up and say, I need a new VM right now, go create it, or I want a new VM, but give me a script to do it. Microsoft, for example, has various tools around. They have their full-scale system-centered virtual machine manager, as well as they're working on things in the dev space, as well as they have something called service management automation, which is a portal for running PowerShell and PowerShell runbooks on premises as well as against Windows Azure. And so these type of environments make it easy for you to say, here's something I want to do, here's a repeatable format, and then now this script is available for people to use in a larger pipeline that's automated or in some kind of self-service configuration. Now for developers in the room, one of the things to think about to get to a really rich DevOps culture and deployment structure for your app is to rethink how your application is architected. Right? One of the big problems for success is when you have things that are too tightly coupled, that can't be evolved independently on their own. So obviously there's a lot that goes into good application architecture, so you have to think about that. But when you think about new features, one of the things you want to do is think about how you can implement it in chunks, in pieces, as well as to get feedback about that new code. This is one of the things that Flickr would do, is that they would release part of a new feature or system functionality to only a subset of users, and so they could do some kind of A/B testing. Give one set of users the feature and another set of users without the feature. They would often put things out, for example, their pro users. And so the idea is that you have code that's very simple at the end of the day. It's all conditional evaluations. Who am I providing this data to? What should I give them? Is this feature online or not online for that user? Microsoft does it for the Visual Studio Online project. As an MVP, I've signed up for what they call dog fooding, which means when they get a feature that basically doesn't cause data loss, I will find it turned on in my account. Right? Sometimes it's a who moved my cheese scenario, and other times it just happens on the back end. Sometimes it's as subtle as a recent update they did, which is that they have large text fields that they have kept small so they fit on a user's small screen. The problem is when you have a large monitor, you're looking at this little text box and you get all this space. So they added a button that lets you expand the dialog full screen so you can type to your heart's content. Well, that's a feature that they do a very simple conditional. Is this person in the dog fooding category? Yes. Enable the button. And that just requires a simple bit of code at that localized place, but then requires larger infrastructure in place. But once it's in place, you can do that kind of checking just about anywhere a user interacts with it, as well as how their data flows to the system. This also affects the notion of how you develop your software and how you do branching. The industry, once again, we're going through this emergence of maturity. One of the big things we did in the 2000s was get organizations onto mature branching strategies. Thinking about how they could separate development from test, right? Maintain quality, and think about release branches and hot fixes and all those things. Particularly in the TFS world, it's been something that we've invested a lot of time and education with customers to get there. That said, the downside to branching in any version control strategy is that it's like a puppy, right? They, on one hand, seem like they're a great thing, but then they pee and rip up things all over the floor. And so what happens is, they require care and feeding. Right? When you have more than one branch, it means you have to think about how I'm going to move changes from one branch to another, and when there's conflicts, how do I deal with those merge changes? For Microsoft, when they were doing in Visual Studio, they would have entire merge days for a particular team. So when your team had a bunch of work to bring up into the main branch, you would get in a room, and you would go through and do it. You would deal with merge conflicts and make sure versions worked, and you would go through and get that to happen. That's a big friction point for a lot of organizations, which is they defer merging because they're like, well, I don't want to deal with it. But the longer you wait, the more conflicts you're going to run into. So what we're seeing in mature teams is, you know what? We're going to have one code line, and that code line is always going to be really awesome and ready to ship. Anytime someone wants to, they can pull from main and deploy. Now, maybe think, well, what do you do for your isolated work? That's why with distributed version control, we see people using Git and using private branches. So you can try things out, but still do commits of high-quality code. And the difference there is that we're reducing that friction point of what goes on in a day-to-day in a team to get code moving.
What about if you want to do fundamental changes to the scheme of the database and the way things work? If you're always working on the draft, how can you manage that?
You can use private branches, and you can still do branches, right? You can in Git, for example, I can have multiple repos. I can have a public branch. It doesn't mean I don't do it. It means you change the day-to-day, right? What's happened is developers, and I'll repeat the question for the video, which is, what if you're doing large changes? Fundamentally what's happened is we've seen branches used as a crutch, right? They're used as a crutch to allow developers to be more sloppy. So the idea is to focus on smaller pieces. Now, when you talk about, yes, I have large-scale changes and things like that, there's a couple things that go on. Number one is often things like schema changes have to be managed a little bit separately because they're such a foundational piece. It's like if you decide to go from one type of code base to another, switch platforms, right? Sometimes those can be so significant, so earth-moving of changes that you have to handle those in a special case. I would argue if that your schema changes are so significant that every time you have to release, you have to do that, you got a problem with your data model, would be one of the things I would say. So I'm not saying you don't branch. I'm not saying you wouldn't even use traditional branches out there. What I'm saying is people are moving towards this model. This is like Flickr. Now, once again, depending on your application, it may or may not work for you also. A good example where it doesn't work well is when you have to support multiple releases for multiple types of customers concurrently. You're going to need those separate branches, and you're going to have to have a more complex strategy, right? So once again, these are general ideas. Obviously, take everything I say with a grain of salt because it might not apply to you. And I'm going to bring us some specific impediments, and data is one of them. I'll talk about some more, but yeah, it's a good point. Shared metrics. This is another one, no secrets. One of the big problems we have in organizations, there's often acrimony between development and operations, right? You know, the IT folks, they're the draconians, they're trying to keep me down, right? They won't let me have the admin rights on my own machine, right? And those developers, man, I let them put an update into production, it just breaks things, and I'm the one who gets yelled at, right? So we've got to break down those barriers, and one way is make sure everybody has the same information, right? We really need to know what's going on. And that means shared dashboards, shared metrics, information that we both see so we understand what's going on. And ultimately, communication. When you watch the video, you'll see that it actually seems like the two guys in the video like each other. I know it's a crazy thing. But really, you've got to talk, and it's got to be not through some formal change process, you know, some change ticket. You know, organizations that run like that with their internal stuff are setting themselves up for failure under the auspices that they're doing right by tracking everything. Yeah, you need to document things, you need to know what's going on, but you need to be able to talk to each other, and there shouldn't be this disconnect where only the two directors talk and the other people can't. They have to go through, you know, infrastructure. So there's a short link for this, and like I said, it'll be up there on the slides again, but watch the video. It's available online on YouTube, and it's really worth your time to get some insight. And remember, this was done back in 2009, so 5 years ago. And it shows you where you can be as an organization. So we've kind of talked in the high level. Now I'm going to drill down into 3 specific areas that I want to talk about, and then I'm going to give you a couple areas that often cause problems for people, and I'm going to give you an example of one area of DevOps that I think is important to consider if you're not already doing it. But people is the first thing. Successful DevOps starts with the people. If you do not have this communication and buy-in, and I'm kind of harping on this because I still run into people that they go, well, how do I get DevOps? Or we're doing DevOps. You don't. If you're really doing DevOps, it's actually obvious, right? It's obvious by your process and how your updates get out there. You need to break down the barriers. You need to break down the organizational structure. You can start with a virtual team, and I see this a lot in enterprises, which is, yes, just because of whether it's legal rules or HR, all these things, they can't just magically make everybody get along. They can't even necessarily be in the same building always. But what you do need to do is start thinking that your core process from when code gets done to when it goes into production needs to be one larger scale team. Now, just like with Scrum, right? Scrum in the enterprise doesn't mean you have a 100-person Scrum team. It means you have Scrum of Scrums. You have multiple teams working together. So you will still have to maintain organizational structure when you have hundreds of people working together. But what has to happen is at that team level, there needs to be this notion that we are able to see from code completion to deployment and not be blocked by some virtual wall created by organizational silo of development and operations. You have to move to real DevOps teams, people that work together day to day and are focused on both things. And this is where there is that cross-pollination of knowledge where people will have to understand what the others are doing. I'm not saying that your average IT pro is going to learn C# or C++ or whatever you use. And I'm not saying the actual average dev is going to learn how to install a server, configure a network switch. So there will be these fringe knowledge bases that we're not expecting full cross-pollination. But once you start thinking about the unit, the thing we're deploying, this application, to the point that it can be monitored, it really needs to be a holistic group of people doing this. Now, we think about interactions, right? We're trying to shorten this cycle time from when we finish something and we need to move to the next step in the release pipeline. So when we think about our software, right, we're thinking that each release often has a release tax. What does it take to get a compiled set of code or a set of scripts and content files like a website out there, right? We have to pay that. And so we've been accumulating these shippable bits. And often one of the big problems is we run into this manual testing cycle, right? We have to have people go through and check it out. And so what we want to do is really cut that down. When we think about the continuous delivery process, right, we have different people along the line that we want to start thinking about how we get those feedback cycles happening. So it turns out that a continuous process is not just we ship it, check it in, and it gets deployed to production. It's like I said, we have these multiple production environments that mean different things. What it does mean, though, is as you do it, it creates a deployable unit that then can be evaluated. So starting at the top there, we have this notion of a check-in that causes a build to kick off, continuous integration. Once again, this is something that most organizations have been doing for a long time, but surprisingly, a lot of organizations aren't doing it right. They make adjustments for the way they work. And what we're trying to do there is get that feedback, right? With continuous integration, the simple thing is, does it compile? All right? I mean, seriously, does it compile is a sad thing to say, but people check in code often that won't compile, right? Sometimes it's a mistake. They're not paying attention. They get a phone call, and then in the middle, they hit check-in. Right? They don't pay attention to the warnings in their IDE. Okay? The next step is, yes, I made some changes, but those changes didn't take into account someone else's changes, and therefore there's an incompatibility, a class definition, an interface definition. Someone changed a database table, right? So some things are things that are caught beyond the compile level. In other words, I didn't change the source completely. I changed my source, and I used a reference DLL, but once I bring them together, that's where the problem is. And one of the ways we find a lot of those things out is through some kind of unit test, right? And once again, this is where I don't get dogmatic, right? If you do TDD, that's awesome. But a unit test today is all I ask from every developer, so that you build up some kind of library of these automated smoke tests that, if done properly, are something that can be run on every build. And that's that instantaneous feedback, did we do something wrong? Then we start thinking about, okay, we go beyond that, and now we want to think about automated acceptance tests, right? Taking our code, putting it into some environment. A virtual environment is often a great way to do this, because often it's hard to mimic production. But we can create small-scale versions of it where we have a few virtual machines that can be orchestrated and used. I go back to what I know. Microsoft has a product, VMware has a product, but they have these virtual lab management products that allow you to take output builds, run scripts that deployed into these VMs, and then run automated validation tests. And there's two types of those. There's what we call integration tests, which are often can be even run through unit test frameworks, but basically run things through the system, but just through the services layer, and talk to the database, for example. And then you even have the point where with VMs, you can deploy the VM and actually pretend a user's logged on and have some kind of automated tool act like a human, right? The mouse clicks, the keyboard types, and you get that full-fledged test through. And this is before it ever goes to a human, because what we're trying to do is see, did we break anything? Now, automated testing can be expensive. That's why we're trying to do as much as we can without trying to touch the user interface. User interfaces, by their very nature, are hard to test. And while there are great tools out there, Microsoft has one, there's other ones from Smart Bear Software has one. There are a lot out there, but they're expensive to maintain and work with. So what we want to do is make sure everything underneath the UI is very testable. That's why I hear things like MVVM for WPF and Silverlight and other types of Windows-based applications. You see MVC architectures on the web so that you can test as much as possible without thinking about the UI, okay? And then, yes, we're going to come in here and let users have a go at it, right? But before we've gotten this far, hopefully we've looked for any triggers that would cause it to come back to us, any problems. So what they've got is something very solid, and that they can generally focus not on retesting the entire system, but looking at the new things you delivered. Now, some of the things like authentication. Authentication then gets a lot of work, because to get even to the new feature, they often have to be found out, who are you, right? So you'll get some extra exercise there, but we want to get them into the feature as soon as possible. And so what happens is that becomes a release. This becomes a release. These are different checkpoints on the pipeline to say, should we move forward or do we not? And depending upon your organization, you can automate everything up to the final approval in order to where the human signs off, where it just happens automagically. Now, ultimately, to do this, we have to improve quality and availability. And so one of the things that happens, right, is we have defects arriving too frequently. And so one of the things you have to do if you're going to build a good DevOps culture and think about how you're going to fix it once you get buy-in from the humans and everybody says, yes, we're going to do this, is that you got to see, how is production today? You know, how good do we feel about our production system? You know, some systems are, you're afraid. You're afraid to change anything because if we do it, the system will fall over. I mean, how many of you have organizations where getting even the latest Windows updates, if you run Windows, is a hassle, right? I go to lots of customers and I'm surprised. I look at their update mechanism. One of my customers gave me a laptop to use to log in, and they control the Windows update. And they updated their VPN software, no one told me, so I couldn't log in. So I called the help desk and they said, yeah. And I thought maybe it was because I didn't have updates. So I went and ran Windows Update manually, right? If you go and you can have a choice. If it's system managed, it'll go from their policy. There's like 50 some odd updates I haven't gotten. But that's the way they do it. They're very paranoid. The way they run their TFS server. Their TFS server, I was like, why aren't you guys on the latest update? Well, excuses were, I don't trust Microsoft, was one of the ones I hear. When I hear that, I'm like, then why do you use it? If you get over it. Either you do or you don't, right? Get another vendor, get another product. But fine. They worry about they've had one bad patch experience, and so Microsoft's forever, the evil empire. Then they go into all the resources, and then I got to take the time, right? It's just, they don't have a good process around it. And so you need to know how your real software is doing, right? How stable is it before you start throwing in all these processes behind the scenes? And so often, when we think about a defect, right, it's a mistake that hasn't really been discovered. And so what we want to do is think about how we can change from being difficult to fix to make it easy. Because these defects and long MTTD and MTTR means a poor customer experience. So what we want to do is start looking at our cycle and make sure we have all these appropriate locations where we're getting handoff or sign-off and we're validating what we're doing. And ultimately it comes down to this continuous learning and improvement, right? You've got to accept the fact that as you go on this journey, you're going to make mistakes. That's probably the biggest thing. There's this fear of failure, and therefore this inability to adopt new practices because you're afraid you're going to fail. You will fail. You will cause trouble. You should be aware of it. Right? I tell people, for example, just a little side story, moving version control. Git has become very popular to the point that Microsoft makes it available now as part of their Team Foundation Server product as a choice. You can choose their traditional centralized version control, or you can use Git. You can use that online in the cloud or on premises. And so some teams are like, hey, we should do this, right? And I go, no, not necessarily, because it's something new. You're going to have to learn it. And I warn people, you will learn code. Everyone will lose code at some point using Git because you'll do something wrong. It's like C++, very powerful, but sometimes unforgiving. Git has a few commands that can do all sorts of pain and suffering things to your code base. And so I tell people, right, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Evaluate in the big picture, and if it seems like it's the right choice, do it, but do it under the guise that, yes, you will have a problem. You'll do something wrong. And as you implement these new processes, especially these more aggressive release cadence, you're going to possibly run into issues. Now, so we're related to the fact that we're going to run into problems. We need to look at what's going on to figure out what those problems are, and ultimately deliver value through this continuous learning cycle. All right? Which means if we follow all these benefits, you're going to ultimately have more efficiency, you'll lower cost, you'll deliver higher quality software, and you'll continue to learn every time you do a release. That's why DevOps has gotten such big attention in the industry, is that we see this as something that is a fundamental shift in how we do things. It also means that people will focus less on the grunt work of software and more on the value part, which is getting new features into the system, making them available to customers, adapting, rinse and repeat. So, what are a couple of problem areas you're going to run into in adopting DevOps? Well, I've already talked about the people thing, right? That's number one. And as I said, we're not going to buy DevOps. And you'll notice so far I haven't really pushed any products on you. I'm going to talk about products in a moment, but it's people and interactions. It's how things get done that's going to make you successful. But from a software development standpoint, two big problem areas are, first of all, versioning your REST services. Now, you might have other web services, so it's a similar problem, but REST is really where it's at these days if you're building any type of connected application. For example, your mobile phones, right? How useful is your phone when it's in airplane mode? Right? Probably the biggest thing you do is you can play games. And that's some games, right? Some games that are not connected to the internet don't even do anything interesting, right? So mobile applications typically are some kind of UI front end, some local caching and intelligence, and they talk to a back-end service. And so versioning your services is one of the big things you'll run into is how do I add new value and how do I adapt without breaking all my clients? Because the other big problem with these mobile phones is that they have stores, right? And if you're going through the public store, there's a delay between when you finish it to where it's available to your users. So you have to think about this. So when you think about REST services, there's a couple different ways to do it. Now, I'm not a Restafarian. I'm not religious about REST, so I don't usually get into this. But the people who are tend to get very excited about one of these solutions. For example, with URL versioning, one of the big issues is that a URL points to a resource, and is the resource really versioned, or is it how you get to it? There's a whole discussion there. And Troy Hunt wrote a great blog post, and I'll give you the URL for his blog. But I love the picture he put here. It's not RESTful if you, stop it. His basic thought was, look, here are 3 big issues that people run into and choices people make, and they all have problems. Nothing's perfect. And he talks about an application he built. It's called Have I Been Pawned? Has anybody heard of it? Okay. So you guys may have run into the issue that there's this issue on the internet where people are having their passwords and usernames compromised. And these bad, evil people are posting them on the internet for everyone to have. So what he did was he built a website that collects this stuff and lets you go type your email address and check to see if you've been pawned. In fact, let's see if I can come over here. And there we go. Left out an E. Have I been pawned? Oh, good. I've got a monthly contest. There we go. One letter. It's amazing how one letter screws up the entire thing. So you'll notice that 152 million Adobe accounts, mail.ru. So there's a bunch that he does. And so what he's gone out there is he's gone and got these lists of username and passwords and put them behind a system to let you type it in. And so luckily, if I put mine in, last time I checked, I'm green. It's not been found. This is good. So you might want to visit here if you have any of these accounts. And he's constantly adding new ones. We just had a notice yesterday. I landed in London. I was turning on my phone, and it talks about how Dropbox has had some kind of compromise. And it looks like it's a third-party service that you would log in to give them your Dropbox credentials, and they would log on for you, which is bad because you really shouldn't be giving your username and password. But the point is, we'll probably see that show up here on the list later. Now, the key thing is that he built this, and when he built the first thing, he wasn't sure how popular it would be, whether it was going to really work out. Well, it did. He found he wanted to change his service. So in his blog post that I mentioned, he talks about those 3 things and what good and bad about them and how the Restafarians, some people would like one way over another. And then you know what he did? He did the craziest thing ever. He didn't create option 4. He just implemented all 3. He actually supports all 3 mechanisms as a way to get to different versions of his API. Okay? So the key thing about this goes back to the discussion of feature flags and branches, right? These type of maturity models require thinking on your part, particularly from a software architecture, on how you're going to evolve your system to be more agile, to be able to handle dynamic changes, to also support multiple versions of the same system. And so services are a big part of that. And then for the gentleman in the front row, what about the database? So I love databases. That was my first thing in systems I got to program was build front ends to talk to databases. To me, an application out of a database isn't interesting. Probably the number one thing is making sure you have good change management. That means that you have some way of differencing your schema from one version to another. Microsoft made a play into this field with their Datadude project, which became a part of the Team System family. Unfortunately, for various reasons, they've kind of let that languish, but the core tools are there. Redgate makes some great tools, and I'm a big fan of their stuff. But fundamentally, it means thinking about your database as 2 entities. There's this notion of the schema, the model, the set of objects that make up the structure. And then there's the production data. Your production data and your production schema represent the truth, no matter what your source code says. Because ultimately, that's where things live. And so you really have to have a good handle on that version of the truth. So it means we want to have in version control some way, whether you go through and just run a script and dump out your schema, particularly the relational database with ANSI SQL, we can dump it out in a textual form, which means at a minimum we can do textual-based differencing. On the other hand, there's exotic third-party tools that will make it visual and let you see things on graphs like Visio and other products. Even the SQL Server tools do diagrams for you. I don't care about that. All I care about is that you have a difference between one and another. The next thing is then thinking about how do we update our database? Is it something we can do on the fly as we update services, or does it require a separate change? Right? When you're talking multiple terabytes of data, right? God forbid petabytes, especially relational data, right? The whole backup restore concept totally changes, right? You don't just randomly make schema changes, right? So I often tell teams that you really have to know what you're dealing with. The older your database system, the more rigor you need, and generally you're going to have a separate change process around the database because it's going to take more time to do, right? I can do virtual IP swap and swap an entire farm of web servers in a couple seconds, microseconds, depending upon the system I'm using, right? I don't switch out terabytes of database, just even today with the fast systems, you just don't, okay? So you do need some rigor around that. You need to really think about data migration and how you're going to make significant changes. And the other thing is you might need to start modernizing your data model for the 21st century. That means maybe not all your data is stored in a relational database. And I'll give you a good example. Microsoft Team Foundation Server. In the first release, the databases that made up the product were, there were multiple specific databases. They had a work items database, they had a version control database, and they had some other config databases. In the 2010 release, they consolidated those down into a minimum of 2 databases. You had a master configuration database, and then you had what's called a collection database. And then you could create new collections if necessary based upon your organizational needs. When they moved to the cloud and created Visual Studio Online, they could have taken that model up to the cloud. They even could have taken the databases and put them into what Microsoft now calls Azure Database, but basically SQL Server in the cloud. But they knew that wasn't going to work, right? Because one of the things they didn't get was geo-redundancy. So they rethought their data model. And this is a testament that it can be done. Today, I have Team Foundation Server 2013. On premises, 2 databases minimum on top of SQL Server 2012 or higher. In the cloud, they still use some SQL Server. They use the SQL database up in Azure. But all the stuff that goes into version control and all my assets, all of my attachments for work items, those are stored in what Azure calls table storage, right? Which is a completely different model. It's not a relational database. And by doing that, they get things like geo-redundancy, where they have 3 simultaneous backups of all your core data. They use SQL Server mostly for metadata and tracking services, which is a much smaller set of data than terabytes of data that might be in someone's version control repository. And the key thing is they have 2 different completely back-end data ends, 2 different data back-ends that are still serviced by the same type of services, and that the client experience is almost 100% the same. It can be done. The question is, do you have the ability to do it and also the maturity to implement it? But I find data is probably the thing that you have to think of a little differently because often the size and complexity, okay? As well as the dependency, right? Often you have this database that then, or databases that are the foundation of everything your company does, okay? Now, are there any tools to make my life better? Absolutely. And what I've done is I've just broken it up into categories, and I'll just talk about things that are important and let you choose what's best for you. Version control, right? You gotta have it. And as I mentioned before, we need version control both for developers, but also for IT pros, for production. Anything you do should be tracked to version control, whether it's the documentation, but definitely things like PowerShell scripts, Bash scripts, Ruby scripts, Chef, whatever you're using should be under version control. Work tracking, you gotta agree on what's going on. For example, Team Foundation Server has a tracking system, but a lot of organizations also have things like help desk Microsoft has a Service Manager product. You need to agree upon where you're going to store the data about your DevOps process, which means everything from the point of something's about to be released into any of those environments to the point that it goes into production. And also so that when an incident comes in, it can be correlated back. Now, Microsoft, for example, and I'm using this just because what I know, there's other tools out there, they have a product for on-premises called System Center Operations Manager, SCOM. And what they did is they created a plugin that when an incident happens in production, right, IT pros have a monitoring system, a console that's to monitor everything from hard disk space to processors to individual systems like your websites, your database servers, et cetera. And these things create alerts, but the alerts console is for IT pros. It lets them see the entire center. As a developer, you probably care about your certain slice, my application. And what they can do is they can take an incident and create a bug inside, or a bug, a system, an operational issue, inside your Team Foundation server, because they created a plugin. And you'll find lots of systems out there, and in this internet age, we're seeing a lot of these plugins on the web that support plugging in different things. Like I can plug in Trello with Jira. I can plug in Trello with Visual Studio Online. So I can actually have one view that is meant for ops that then maps onto what developers see. User voice is another great example. Does anybody know what user voice is? No? Oh, this is sad. Let's bring some happiness to your life. He's like, dude, the pub is where some happiness is, not user voice. So user voice is a company that provides a service that allows you to gather feedback from your customers, from your users, and thus it can be public-facing or private. So anybody use Visual Studio? Do we have, there's some Microsoft people here? Okay, good. I feel better now. I was a little worried. So if you go to Visual Studio if I knew how to type, uservoice.com, you can come in here and tell Microsoft things you don't like about Visual Studio. And you can get your friends and you can vote. And basically what you can do as a company, you can set up your own user voice site. And if you have a public-facing product that people use, they can come in here and put in information and say, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is what I'd like you to change and fix. Okay? Now, what they did was, Microsoft worked with them, and they created a plugin that allows you to link through what are called service hooks, Visual Studio Online accounts with user voice. Which means there's this view that people see for the data, which is, I want you to fix, let's see, what's this top vote here? Store project-related information in a VS folder to avoid polluting the root of the project. So 2,246 people think that's important. And then going down, then 236 people think the light switch roadmap is important. And so you can do languages, there's TFS, all sorts of stuff. So if we go to TFS, let's see what the number one thing there is. Rename a project in TFS. Woohoo, we're up to 5,560 votes. Okay, if you use TFS, you know how inane this one is. The point is, you vote here. Then what can happen is, if you want, you can have the data from here pushed into your Visual Studio Online account, aka TFS in the cloud, and that can now be a product backlog item. Same data, but you have a different lens on top of it. And then you might add supplementary data. So think of a Venn diagram, right? We have this intersection of common data, and then we might have specialized data per system. All right? So getting this feedback is critical to your system, and that's why you need to have good work tracking to know what people want. Now, assembling and packaging. So this is your whole build process. How do we get things that our users or developers create into formats that can be deployed and packaged? So sometimes it's just compilation. Sometimes it's collecting other assets. Sometimes it's packaged into some deployment unit. For example, SQL Server has something called DAC packs. And it's a way to take schema information into a format that you can push to a server, and the server will load it in and then update the schema, as well as do things like data migrations and even load table data like lookup items. Deployment. This is a hot area right now. You're going to find lots of companies selling their wares and trying to get you to buy their products. There's some old names out there, as well as some new names. In the Windows space, we have a range of things in that there's things like Octopus Deploy that are very focused around taking stuff from your build server and getting them into production through some kind of release pipeline. Microsoft has a new product called Release Manager that they released last year. As well as there's larger scale generic products like Chef and Puppet, which do not only app deployment, but will also set up infrastructure. Microsoft has something called PowerShell DSC. The bottom line, if you're in the Windows space, you really should be learning some PowerShell, even if your core job is development. And then we start getting into monitoring, right? How do you know when something bad happens? Right? We have tools like New Relic on the web that can help monitor your website. Microsoft has tools both on-premises and in the cloud. And then there's this notion of analytics. And analytics is what I'm going to show you a demo of, which is how do we really know what's going on with our applications, particularly when we start getting to things like mobile phones. One of the things we run into is twofold. Number one, we want to know when something bad happens, when the application crashes, right, or the user has something out of the ordinary happen, an exception. But one of the problems in some organizations is we go back to that backlog, that list of wishes, those votes that you see here, right? Because if you ask someone what they want, generally they'll tell you everything. And if you tell them to prioritize, well, they'll kind of often tell you things. But where's the real information? The real information is what do your users use, right? What parts of the application really get exercised? Where are their big time lags, right? Data that can be analyzed can provide insight and really help you change the way you approach things. And so when we start looking at these are kind of, first of all, the order of how you do things, right? You got to build it so you get into version control, then you track your work. But it's also in this level of maturity, right? There's no point in having analytics if you can't ship anything, right? So we really got to have some kind of deployment process going on. Right? If we never get to production, there's nothing there to monitor, right? So while you can address all these in an organization at some point, it's this kind of flow that gets us to the point where, if we had analytics, that could totally change what we did at the top. So let's do an example. So Preemptive Analytics is a product from the company's Preemptive. They're out of the United States. And they've been doing this a while. They got started, I think it was 2008, 2009, in this game. What I like about Preemptive over some of the others, which I'll mention in just a second, is that they cover all the major areas. They cover Java, they cover .NET, C++, JavaScript, all the modern Microsoft stuff. They work with Xamarin. In fact, the app I'm going to show you is built on top of the Xamarin tools on an Android. And they, as I said, Rich, they work with non-Microsoft through things like Java. And so their coverage is very broad, first of all. Second of all, they support all types of user type or different types of domains. So whether it's enterprise line of business or consumer-facing applications, they're designed to support that. And their deployment type is meant to be very flexible. You can run through hosted services. You can run all the stuff on premises. In addition, if you do use Team Foundation Server, they have specialized integrations so that you can take incidents that come through their analytics and translate those into work items or bugs inside your Team Foundation Server. Now, I took some screenshots because I never know if there's going to be internet. Plus, it's a lot easier for you to see the screen than what's on the phone. But basically, it's a simple sample app to show you how. So, right, we see the same thing. It just lets you do different things. And in fact, the first item up here is capture feedback and preferences. But what I want to show you first is down at the bottom, there's this show identity. So I'm going to do the identity, and mine's coming up. You probably can't see it, but sir, can you verify that that says finance? Can you see that? Finance, all right, great. And so the session idea is just a way to uniquely identify me from someone else doing the demo, okay? Now, if we go to capture feedback and preferences, what it has is a simple slider to say your happiness index, and then we'll be able to pick our favorite color. So for example, I could set the index to 10 in a color of red, and I'm going to do that in a minute, okay? And we also can capture things like exceptions, both handled, thrown, and unhandled. And then what's happened is all this data is going to be available to us on the analytics dashboard. And remember I talked about this earlier, having this shared information store so you can figure out what's going on, who's using your apps, etc. Now, the key extra bit of value we're getting here is not only do we get all the runtime info, in other words, the application blew up, okay, or I had this many users. With a little bit of code, you get the extra insight that can tell you, what features your user's actually executing, right? The happiness index and the color are irrelevant. The point is that these are touch points where the user makes a decision, and we have the ability to capture that and then visualize it, okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to switch over to my browser again. And let's go to the dashboard. And we'll do a refresh. Okay, make sure I'm live. Okay. And so what we can see here is I'm a returning user. I returned earlier. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch this down to the last 7 days. Okay. And if we go down here to, let's go to custom data. No, I want to go up to critical activity. Here we go. All right, so finance, we're at 7 sessions. And if we look at the last check-in, it looks like I did a value of 10. And the last color I did was yellow. So I'm going to let this gentleman in the front row, since I'm picking on him, give me a different number besides 10. What do you want your happiness number to be? How happy are you right now? Are you at least a 6? He's a 6. Okay, so we'll slide that over to a 6. And let's see if I can get that to a slide. It's a slider, so how about 6.5 or 6.6? Is that okay? Do you see that? All right. And favorite color, you can pick anything but yellow. I have aqua, I have black, blue, fuchsia, gray, green, lime, maroon, navy, olive, purple, red, silver. You want to do fuchsia? Fantastic. All right, so we'll verify that color. I went by it, thankfully. Okay. So does that look like your choices? All right. Now I'm going to hit submit. Okay, it said, thank you for submitting my data. Now what I'm going to do is go back, and while we wait here, I'm also going to go to monitor exceptions, and I'm going to click the handled exception. So I did a division by 0, and that sent exception data back up to the server also. So what we're going to do here is come over here, and we're going to refresh. And look what happened. Real-time data. Fuchsia was what you picked, sir, right? And I believe you said we picked 6.6, so that would be you right there. So 6.59, a little rounding error there. All right? This is the type of thing that analytics will bring you, is that, number one, real-time what's going on. And I'm not saying you're going to sit at the dashboard the whole time. It's fun, for demos. But the point is, now you can go through here. You can have this logged. You can run reports against this. And, of course, when something bad happens, you'll be able to get information about it, like a division by 0 error just now, okay, in real time. Microsoft has this. Xamarin recently launched, so what's interesting about Xamarin and Microsoft both is Xamarin announced one last week, their show at Evolve, that's optimized around their platform for building mobile apps. Microsoft has a new one called Application Insights that they've been working on, and they announced publicly last year. There's still an active development of it. And then you have preemptive as that, and there's others, like I said, there's more specialized, as well as you can build your own. The key thing about analytics is getting that insight into how your users are using your application and how well your application is doing. That what your users are using will help basically prioritize your backlog. I don't know about you, but I've been in a meeting with 2 different managers, and one basically, the one who's the nastier person is the one who usually gets their way, because they kind of bully their way through features. Whereas when you have data about what your users are choosing and what they're coming from, for example, have you ever wondered if you should localize your app beyond English? Right? Well, the question is, well, where are users coming from? You might be surprised, particularly the people that are paying for it versus not paying for it. Right? Having analytics in your app, in your front end, whether it be a web page or whether it be in a mobile app or even a desktop app, could be the game changer in that entire flow of your DevOps process. So, now I want to show you one more thing. Actually, let's go back over here. Is if we go over here to Visual Studio Online, you'll notice that I had 4 exceptions here. I'm going to come over here and we're going to rerun this query. And did I get one? All right, that might have been turned off. But the point is, when there is a division by 0 error, it can create a work item inside TFS. Okay? So you can even have an issue show up automatically to your dev team if it's determined to be a particular type. There's other ways to do this. As I said, on-premises System Center integrates with this. But once again, don't look at even the things like analytics as an isolated product, right? The goal is to get that holistic view across the board so everybody sees the same information, but possibly through a different lens, right? You might not need to have every developer on that dashboard, but every developer should be looking at their backlog and where their bugs come from. Okay, had that one. All right, and these are just screenshots so you can see them later, but basically you can see where they're coming from in the world, time, exception count, and as you saw, we had the color chart to show what features they picked. Now this app, I want to show you just a couple pieces of the code. And let's see, we go full screen here. The first thing, the way the app works is that it sets up an unhandled exception handler, right? So that's how you get the top level if the application is going to blow up. You can catch that. And then this code, in turn, is able to report the exception right there by using the preemptive client and reporting the exception and putting the data in, and that's how it gets logged to the system. So it's just a couple lines of code and referencing the appropriate assemblies. And then for the feedback page, it's simply an option of deciding what data you want to capture, and then you'll see right here, there's this client factory that you call feature tick, and you push the data in. So you can have individual features to the very granular level of an individual control. You can do pages that they access, and basically correlating the features they use with where they come from, as also, remember I said the finance user, even what department, can all be ways that you take the data, analyze, and prioritize what you're doing. And that's the great thing about a lot of these newer tools, is that they don't require significant effort. A lot of them will give you base functionality out of the box, right? You just hook in their library, and they will capture some stuff. But this shows you can get very granular to the point of, as you saw, a UI slider control and picking the color as data that I want to capture very specifically, okay? And this goes back to this notion of feature flags and having the thought process in your code that can do things based upon conditions. Who the user is, when they log in, etc. All right. So now, slides and links, as I said, I'll put the slides up here as well as links to the Flickr video, which I recommend you watching, as well as Preemptive's website where you can get info on that stuff, as well as I'll put links to some of the products I mentioned, like Xamarin's new tool, like the App Insights. So there's a few URLs you'll get also. In either case, just remember, DevOps is about people first, right? You don't buy DevOps off the shelf. You need to get people to buy in, then work on how you're interacting. Look at your release pipeline. Look at how code gets from a developer's hands into the various production environments. That means, how does it get to test? How does it get to staging? How does it ultimately end up to production? How does it get tracked back? How do you know what's going on? And then, yes, then go look at the tools. Then assess, hey, would an analytics package help us? Should we look at Git as an alternative to our current version control? Or would it help us with our current needs? What are you doing to track work? How do users give feedback? Would user voice help you? Can you interact better with your help desk ticketing system? Going back to that people thing, you need to break down those barriers so that everybody has access to the information you need to create an effective process. It's not something you just buy, it's something you do. You continue to evolve, continue to learn, and hopefully improve. On that note, thank you very much for coming. I've left about, give or take 10 minutes for questions if you have any. So, any questions?
How do you see dedicated release teams fitting into the DevOps? Because there's a lot of companies do this. For example, Facebook seem to have a dedicated release team, but they also continuously release. They do like 10 pushes to production, or have done in the past. I think they've kind of stopped the go fast and break things mode now. But how do you see dedicated release teams fitting into the DevOps culture?
So the question is, how do I see release teams fitting into a larger DevOps culture? Well, what it is having a dedicated release team is one of those stepping stones to it. Eventually, the release team should be the DevOps team. It should be this thing. Now, there's two things to think about. Number one is often when you get something like a release team, they become very specialized in certain core aspects of your data center, of how things get out there, okay? And what has to happen is, depending on the size of the organization, is their job is going to be educating. So for example, a project I'm working at, this large hardware manufacturer right now, there's 3 of us that are forming what the manager who hired us to be a DevOps team. There's myself, who's on a short-term contract, there's a long-term contract, and there's an FTE. Us 3 people have a simple goal. They have 40 teams that we have to help improve their process. So these are 40 different Scrum teams. And so what we're doing is we're addressing things at a generic level. For example, how can we improve and reduce their cycle time? Right now it takes them 3 days to get from a build that succeeds out of CI into their core test environment, which actually has things like production data that they can test against, okay? 3 days. So we're looking at how do we fix that. So our job right now is to be the thought leaders, help them find the problems, also deal with a lot of the organizations, like we're fighting friction points and getting resources and things like that. And then one of our jobs is we're going to enable those teams. So a dedicated release team starts with the fact that they help improve the core process and then educate. Now at some point, they could be just the core continuous improvement leadership team helping the individual sub-teams. If the company's smaller, they should be moved back into a team. As far as every team should be thinking DevOps, should be thinking release. It shouldn't be a separate team that handles it. In other words, we don't want a complete disconnect. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has admin rights to go and party on the production servers. But there is this notion of visibility and a way to get things done. And in fact, most of the time we don't want people with admin rights doing things. What we want is people going to dashboards or automated processes and clicking buttons and signing off. So that's how you deal with some of the security things. But bottom line is, a release team is a good step forward because it shows a thought process and maturity around that. But ultimately, a release process is a temporal thing that shouldn't exist if you have true DevOps. Yes, sir.
How do you manage people who maybe are resistant to this culture?
Fire them.
What if that's not an option in the
Yes.
HR laws in the country that you live in?
There's all sorts of things they can do. Why don't you get them a copy of Visio and have them make diagrams? In all this seriousness, and I'm addressing this to the video too. Look, it's real simple. If you don't change your culture, if you're not willing to change, your company's going to fail, right? At this point, we have enough data, we have enough information to show that software can make or break a company.
People might be above you as well, not necessarily below you.
Yeah, and in that case, you need to appeal to the thing that drives them. So 2 things that appeal to most management people is, number 1, making more money, and 2, staying out of jail. Fundamentally, those are the things. So you need to appeal to them from the financial standpoint. I'm actually doing a slightly different bent on this talk next week at Redgate Sequel in the City called 4 Weddings and a Funeral, ALM and DevOps. And I don't want to give the whole story away, but the funeral has to do with the fact that a company went out of business because someone did a manual production update. Okay? They went into debt within about 10 minutes. It was in the New York Stock Exchange, $750 million in a matter of minutes. The company went out of business. Depending on your industry, you could either put the company out of business, you could kill someone or multiple people. So fundamentally, if the approach is we're trying to do better isn't good enough, you need to appeal to the financial aspect. So it might be something as simple as saying, we're going to do this, it'll equal this. I can't just give you a raw number. But what you can say is, here are the things that we're seeing as impediments to a successful agile development process. And when I say development process, I mean development to deployment to the entire thing. So you need to appeal to those different things. For example, the C-levels, have to be appealed to like anybody else. What's in it for them? And what you want to do is put this in a larger scale package of, you'll get features faster, we'll be able to be more nimble, be able to adapt to things. Find things that you were not able to do because of your current process, which is maybe development had a fix done, but it wasn't available for some big event, and so they couldn't show something. Maybe the new website wasn't ready to take orders in time for the holidays. Whatever it is, there's always something that you can appeal to. And like I said, it's real simple. It's marriage or it's death, right? It's marriage, the happy celebration. I look at the wedding as a celebration of life. It's a joie de vivre. It's a great thing, right? And over here in the UK, I've been to them. You guys do good weddings. You can have a good time. But funerals suck, right? Well, and what's the biggest death for a lot of people besides physical death is losing a job. How do you want to get your pink slip because you screwed up on the production deployment, right? And last time I checked, most C-levels and directors who care about their company want to stay in business because they like their paycheck. So it's appealing to the primal urges, right? Money and life. So
the response to the threat of going to another funeral is actually let's wrap all this in iron fences and scatter guns and barbed wire and make it really, really difficult to change because I don't want to go to another funeral.
Well, what you got to show them, then that's where you say, look, not making change is just as bad as making change, in that we need to be able to rapidly respond to business. What you have to do is an appeal to the business case. Can you give me your industry you're in?
Financial services.
Financial services, right. So, everything I know about financial services is that data is king and speed is king. And so if you can't adopt to the latest needs, you're going to become antiquated, right? In other words, if you can't respond to what your market wants, the people who pay you, and then you have to look at the different places where you're not responding. Let's say, for example, you don't have a mobile client, or maybe you don't update your website fast enough, whatever it is, right? Those things are impediments to a successful business. Successful businesses make money. If you're not successful, you're not going to make money. It won't matter how good your fence is if no one's behind the fence to protect, right? It's like a closed factory. Hey, I've got great fences protected, but there's nothing going on inside, so who cares? So that's how you have to do it. Now, honestly, depending on where you're at in an organization, this is going to require forming teams. And sometimes this is outside your comfort zone. If you're the agent of change, you might have to get into things. If you're a public company, your annual report's going to have information you need. If you're not public, you're going to have to probably work with people appropriately, right? No breaking into systems. But you're going to have to get into some information. People know sometimes at a gut level, let alone from a day-to-day, what affects the company. But if you're publicly traded, it's easy to get that information to where you can translate that to management and produce a plan. Sometimes, sadly, for some of you, it means leaving the organization you're at, because the organization is unchangeable until they fail at a dramatic level. If you don't want to be around for that, you have to leave. And I understand sometimes in the current job economy that's not great, but IT right now, we're pretty employable. So sometimes it requires moving, but it's a pretty good market out there. So try and be an agent of change, address the business thing, but it's the same thing. You can't avoid death, right? You can't avoid mistakes. All the protection of the world doesn't stop things from happening. So it's a straw man argument to avoid the funeral as to why you won't change. Because you're going to die eventually. It's just how.
I'm pretty sure you're talking to a room of the converted. It's just looking for...
Oh, this is supposed to be the unbelievers.
And what we want to do is go back to our organisations and look for the right buttons to press.
Yeah.
I'm sure other people recognise what I'm saying here is how do we tell the boss's boss?
Yeah.
He's nice and safe, and he or she is in a comfortable position right now. We don't want to threaten that.
Well, the threat, though, is that if the company relies upon software at all to be successful, they're not in a safe position if you cannot effectively deliver solutions that deliver those needs. So if you look at what I put in the slides, right, the core things are there. It's how do you correlate that and translate it to, what are your current pain points, right? Hopefully it's not everything, because everything's hard, right? If you have everything. So one thing is just look at analytics, right? Analytics might be your gateway drug to that change, because you can say, these are the things we're finding out, but we can't get here rapidly enough because we have all these blockers. Look at your mean time to find a defect, mean time to repair that defect, right? If a bug gets happened, how long does it take? Or does it require the entire company stopping what they're doing to get a bug fixed when you're on fire? Those things can be addressed as organizational friction that's costing you money. It's costing you hours, right? And the honest thing is, if it hasn't costed you money from a visible sense on the outside, it's just a matter of time. Right? So at the end of the day, it's appealing to the sense of urgency based upon money and profit for a lot of people. Sadly, you don't eat well because you're supposed to. You eat well because oh, my league starts. I'm overweight. I get out of breath walking up the stairs out of the tube. Right? Oh, maybe that'll change. Right? Pain. If it's not the carrot, it's the stick.
One obstacle I see to introducing this is security testing. And to the best of my knowledge, that's not automatable at this point in time. And I may be wrong, but that's the best of my knowledge.
Security testing is not automatable? Sure it is. You can automate everything.
Pen testing?
Well, you can also have humans do that. You don't have to, first of all, automation isn't the panacea for every possible test format. As I mentioned, UI testing can be very expensive. Microsoft actually does less automated UI testing in Visual Studio than they did before, because the reason was automated testing was an impediment that if they wanted to change the UI, the test team fought back and say, well, if you do this, it'll break this many tests, right? And once again, so that's an area that you still do manually. In other words, get everything else humming, and then if that's the last thing you have to worry about, you're doing really awesome, right? If your problem is that you only have to do manual security testing, you're humming along. You can still do automated testing of security. There's security tools out there, there's toolkits. How do you think these hackers hack into 100 million websites at a time, right? Have you ever looked at your audit logs for your firewall? Security testing is automatable, very automatable. Unfortunately, those toolkits just aren't usually off the shelf or offered to you by your typical vendors like Microsoft and IBM. You often have to go to the Black Hat conferences. I have a guy I work with. He goes to the thing. He's a Linux freak. He works at a company. He works in C++ and Windows, but this is his hobby. And he's giving me, if you ping me, I'll send you a couple books that he's recommended. Oh, it's fully automatable, sir. Absolutely. But once again, it's just a matter of getting the right tools and the right techniques. There's a gentleman named Kevin Mitnick. He's hireable, but trust me, he doesn't sit there and spend days on end. He's got a set of tools. He fires those off and he abuses people. And then often the way he delivers his report, the last time he posted about this, the gentleman said, so where's my report? He goes, it's on your desk. He goes, no, it's not. He goes, no, it's on your desktop. He had put the document on the CIO's desktop on his machine. So yeah, trust me, the world of the bad folks is fully automated because that's how they attack millions of machines at a time. That said, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer and I'm definitely not a security expert, so my advice in this area is very limited. But I can point you in the right direction. But literally, it's those secured ops conferences. There's a lot of tools you can get. The Linux community has an amazing cadre of tools for abusing your systems. All right, well, if you have more questions, just come on up. I'm going to start tearing down. I think we're done for the day last time I checked. I don't know if is there a like get together for you guys? I have no idea what's next. Coffee break. So oh no, that was 3:30. I think you're done, right? Oh, there's beer? Oh, it's Wednesday, that's right. It's 17:30, 5:30. Now, shoot, I apologize. Get out of here, go on. But please get the app, and I imagine it's for iOS too, and even Windows Phone, but at a minimum, go to the app, tell us what you think. If you have feedback for me, send me love mail, hate mail, I'll take it all. Like I said, I'll post the slides later tonight up on my GitHub repo in a PDF. They'll also be on the conference website. Thanks a lot. Hope to see you later. Bye-bye. Alaska Airlines was one of the first airlines to allow you to do online check-in and print your boarding pass at home. FedEx, of course, made a name for it worldwide for fast package delivery, right? Amazon, another company that changed the way we thought about buying products online to the point of adding things like, hey, give us some subscription money in advance, and we'll give you free deliveries all year long. And we'll make it 2-day, at least in the US. And I know here in the UK, you guys can even get single-day delivery as part of your Prime membership. So those companies all were able to do that, not from sheer will and manpower, but by adding technology. I mean, how many of you would think about flying an airline now if you couldn't do some type of online check-in? And arguably, some won't even let you. Like Ryanair charges you extra if you want to check in at the airport, right? They still charge you for a seat now, or is it just for baggage, right? I mean, they were trying to do that one where you stand up or kind of lean, I thought it was. So when you think about it, right, technology really is at the core of everything we do in business. So when we think about DevOps, right, and take this notion of bringing together two things that seem completely separate, the first thing is we're thinking about this full lifecycle investment. And this has been this evolution in the industry as we've grown more mature, right? Does anybody here work on a software team that doesn't use source control? You do. I'm sorry, you need to leave now.
I'm sorry, we're having trouble getting one in. It's an old 4GL code base we've got. So
Okay. Well, you're working on it. Okay, well at least you're working on it, that's good. The first thing you don't want to hear from the audience is what source control, right? Then we know we're in the wrong room. No, the meeting for the Dentists Association is around the corner. What's happened is we've started baselining some things that most organizations should have and take for granted, which is things like version control, the ability to track work. worst part of this is dealing with my home technical support, my wife and my family, right? Because I work with computers, I obviously have all the answers, and if something's not working, I have all the trouble. And it was funny that this morning of all times, I got up and logged on. I was doing email in the hotel room, and I needed to get something off of my computer at home. So I went to log in and couldn't get to it. Now, luckily, I have 2 connections, so I went to the older, slower DSL connection. I was able to get in and basically figured out that my faster cable connection was down. So I put a note out there, checked, and sure enough, they're having trouble. Great. And this is about 2 a.m. Pacific, so my wife's going to get up about 6:30, and my children are going to get up. And like any connected family, they're all going to try and get onto the internet. So I had to send an email and say, sorry, it's not my fault. They're working on it. And so when you think about how something as simple as that affects larger enterprises, we start thinking about how do we prevent problems. Now, fundamentally, probably the biggest thing to realize is that this idea of a software company isn't really in existence anymore, because every company is a software company. If you fundamentally think about a modern organization, you can't really get by without some type of software. And then what's happening in more mature organizations, particularly small, medium, and large that are showing maturity, are realizing that that competitive advantage can be had through software. Now, granted, we do have entire industries that seem to start up out of software. A good example is Uber. Right? Here's a company that doesn't have any traditional infrastructure, doesn't even own their own cars. Right? What they've done is create a business out of software. But that doesn't mean that existing enterprises go away just because of that. And that means if you want to have an advantage in your industry, it's often going to come from custom software that helps your business be more agile and respond to demands out there. So when we think about modern software development, you're really thinking about how agile can you be and how quickly can you respond. When we think about this cycle, we have to plan what we're going to do, develop and test it, get out to production, and then hopefully monitor and learn what goes on. Right? In particular, what we're trying to do is change the cycle from a very reactive, something's on fire mentality, there's bugs, it doesn't work, it's broken, and move to we've released something, it works, it doesn't work, we can quickly fix it and adapt. We find out from both a standpoint of functionally does it work, right? Does it have a problem? To the more subtle, does it work for our users, right? Oftentimes, a software developer's interaction with a user, a customer, a person, is that screaming person on the phone, or it's that hate-filled email, or God forbid you have a public website where they can leave comments, right? The thought process behind half the internet, it seems, is just to troll you with the most abusive language possible. So what we're trying to do is reduce those cycles and therefore reduce the friction point that occurs between the use of our software and the people who use it. DevOps itself is really an emerging trend. And for some people, they've been doing it all along. They just didn't have it codified. But a lot of organizations, it isn't. In particular, because lots of organizations, particularly enterprises, have separate silos responsible for development versus operations. And so the idea behind DevOps is changing from the top down the culture of a company and how it manages its software systems. And so this quote from CIO Magazine is basically just saying, look, if you want a sustainable advantage, you're going to have to be agile. And you have to be agile beyond the actual creation of the code, but all the way through to the enterprise, and think about how fast you can respond, right? Respond to those business changes, right? One of the things we think about with agile software is this notion of a first mover advantage. When you think about the companies that first did something competitive, in the United States, we modeled those things in the 90s around what was called the software development lifecycle, the SDLC. And then as the industry's matured, we started thinking about, well, there's much more to software. And as software has permeated industry and most modern organizations, what we're saying is we need to think about a larger picture. And that's where ALM comes in, Application Lifecycle Management. Now, ALM has 3 core tenets. It has development, it has operations, and then it has governance. When we think about governance, that's all the stuff that most of the time developers don't want to think about if you're a software person. In that it's, how's this thing going to get paid for? How are we going to allocate resources? But it's also, how does a software project fit into a larger organizational need? I'm sure you're familiar with Boeing and Airbus, right? Boeing recently launched their 787 Dreamliner. We'll avoid the battery discussion. But that plane cannot function without software. an Airbus A380 cannot function without software. But as we know, right, the amount of money it costs to build a single aircraft is in the millions of pounds. As such, when you're managing the budget for that, software is a component of that. But if you're thinking of a larger scale budget, you're not thinking necessarily about if the developer is using C# or Java or some other language, right? You're kind of looking at a much higher level view. And so governance in ALM is that we have this separation between how the developers might work, but the fact that they might need to provide data up to the larger organization. Okay, so ALM is all about thinking about software from inception, that idea, to when it's actually taken out of life. Now the thing about ALM is that it is modeled on the more traditional separation of concerns between development and operations. It sees those as two different entities. And what's changing now is that we're saying that doesn't work. That actually creates too much friction between the two different portions of the organization, in that when development hands it off, it's kind of like this, okay, I finished, I did my part, here it is, throw it over the wall. You get it in production, you monitor it, you take care of it. This is Building a DevOps Culture. My name is Brian Randell. Slides and links, so I'm going to reference a couple different things on the internet, so rather than have you feverishly scribble them down, I've got a GitHub repo up here that I will upload my slides up to after this talk in a PDF, as well as I'll put any links that I mentioned. There's a couple in particular, and I'll put this up again at the end, as well as I'll give the slides to Chris. They'll be up on the Software Architect site, as well as available through the app, so you'll be able to get those multiple ways. So who am I? I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. We're a small consultancy out of the United States who do a lot of work in the Microsoft space. I'm an ALM MVP for Microsoft, which means I spend way too much time with their tooling around Visual Studio, Team Foundation Server, and Visual Studio Online. I've co-authored a book that if you go and buy that at amazon.co.uk, I might get 25 pence or something. But in either case, I spend a lot of time with this, and DevOps in particular has become something that has now been formalized and codified in the industry. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is how you can bring this culture to your organization and some of the challenges you're going to face, and talk about how you can get around that possibly. When I think about who you might be, you attach the blinky thing to it. When I think about who you are, do you ever feel like this? Or how about that? Have you ever been on the phone with someone like that? Let's be honest. This is how we feel about technology sometimes, right? I mean, fundamentally, if you're in software development, you have one of the best jobs around, and you can also have one of the worst jobs around. I know for me, probably the